In 1945, the acclaimed English writer, George Orwell, published an article and used the term Cold War for the very first time to refer to a state of nuclear stalemate between two superstates. He predicted that the superstates would come to possess nuclear weapons, but fail to destroy each other out of fear of retaliation. Ironically, his predictions came true, and after the surrender of Nazi Germany at the end of the Second World War in the same year, the United States and the Soviet Union became ultimate rivals engaged in a Cold War. The Cold War lasted for decades, and resulted in international incidents that almost led the two superpowers to the brink of mutual destruction. The Cold War differed from a normal war in several ways. Namely, the engaged parties largely tried to avoid direct military confrontations with each other. Instead, they tried to instigate ideological conflicts with the help of proxies to spread their influence to as many countries as possible. This tactic was especially effective at the time, since many countries had been left in a devastated and dependent state after the Second World War. The Soviet Union was determined to spread communism around the world and safeguard against any renewed threat from Germany. They started their mission by installing left-wing governments in Eastern European countries that had been liberated by the Red Army. The US feared that their influence would spread to Western European countries as well, and threaten democracy. Thus, they instigated their own strategies to stop the Soviets. By this time, the two nations had already initiated the Cold War, the silent war of ideologies. By 1953, the Cold War had reached its peak. The Soviets attempted to blockade West Berlin to force US and its allies to abandon their jurisdictions, and their support of the Communist government of North Korea had a significant role in setting off the Korean War. In response, US and its European allies formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, also known as NATO, to resist the Soviet presence in Europe. After Joseph Stalin's death in 1953, the war came to a short-lived halt until 1960, when the Soviets promised to defend Cuba, and proceeded to secretly install medium and intermediate-range ballistic missiles in Cuba, which didn't remain secret for a long time. In fact, the Soviets could have easily used those missiles to launch nuclear attacks on the US targets. The news of their conducts in Cuba quickly reached the ears of US authorities. This sparked the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, which brought the two nations to the brink of nuclear devastation until the Soviets agreed to withdraw. A year later, they signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty to prevent any sort of nuclear confrontation. By the early 70s, a lot of countries which were considered relatively inferior to the two nations and great targets for a proxy war, started to advance economically, and were no longer willing to be influenced by these superstates. Thus, the Cold War continued uneventfully with a heavy emphasis on massive arms build-up for a few years, until 1980, when Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union, and the Soviet bloc countries in Eastern Europe collapsed. Gorbachev was attempting to reform the Soviet Union's internal affairs and democratize the country, but his efforts had weakened the Communist Party. This allowed power to shift to Russia, and the other constituents of the Soviet Union became independent countries. Finally, in 1991, with the shift to the democratic and anti-communist country of Russia, and the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the Cold War came to an end.